On the morning of October 17th, 1781, a British drummer boy climbed onto a parapet at Yorktown, Virginia, and began to beat a rhythm that every soldier on that battlefield instantly recognized. It was the call for parley, the universal signal, understood on every battlefield in Europe and its colonies, that one side wanted to talk rather than fight. Beside him stood a British officer, waving a plain white handkerchief tied to the tip of his sword. For a few seconds, the largest collection of artillery ever assembled on American soil simply stopped firing. After 3 straight weeks of nearly continuous bombardment, a siege so intense that British soldiers had taken to sheltering in caves dug into the riverbank, where officers' wives and the wounded huddled together while shells screamed overhead, the guns went silent. The drummer boy and the officer were blindfolded and led through the lines. What they were carrying was the beginning of the end of the American Revolutionary War and the unraveling of a general who, 18 months earlier, had been the single most successful field commander Britain had in North America. His name was Charles, Earl Cornwallis. He had chased George Washington across New Jersey in 1776. He had crushed an entire American army at Camden, South Carolina, in 1780, killing or capturing nearly 1,000 men in an afternoon. By any reasonable military logic, this was not a general who should have ended his war blindfolded, marching out under flag of surrender, handing his sword to an enemy he had every right to believe he would eventually outlast. And yet 2 days later, on October 19th, 1781, Cornwallis surrendered an army of roughly 8,000 British and Hessian soldiers, the last major field force Britain had in the rebellious colonies, to a combined American and French force he had been told, repeatedly, by his own superior officer, was coming to rescue him. The rescue never came, and the war that should have been unwinnable for the United States ended, for all practical purposes, in a tobacco port on the Virginia coast. Before we get into how that happened, if you're new here, this channel goes deep into the moments that actually decided history, not just the famous headlines. Hit subscribe now so you don't miss where this story goes, because the chain of decisions that led to Yorktown is one of the most quietly absurd command failures in British military history. To understand how Britain's most successful general in America ended up trapped on a peninsula with his back to the water, you have to follow a year of strategic confusion that started with a genuine military triumph. By 1780, the war in the North had settled into stalemate. Washington's Continental Army, dug in around New York, was too weak to dislodge the British garrison there, and the British, after the disasters of 1777 and the failure to crush the rebellion in its early years, had shifted strategy. London's new plan, often called the Southern Strategy, was to use Loyalist sympathy in the Carolinas and Georgia to roll the rebellion back from the south, region by region, using the southern colonies as a base to eventually squeeze the north. Cornwallis was central to that plan, and for a while it worked spectacularly. At the Battle of Camden in August 1780, his forces routed an American army under General Horatio Gates, the same general who had accepted Burgoyne's surrender at Saratoga 3 years earlier, inflicting catastrophic casualties and capturing enormous quantities of supplies. It was, by any conventional measure, one of the most lopsided British victories of the entire war. But the Southern strategy began to unravel almost as quickly as it had succeeded. Brutal partisan warfare across the Carolinas, fought largely between Loyalist and Patriot militias, often with savage personal cruelty on both sides, bled British resources and never produced the wave of Loyalist support London had been counting on. A string of smaller engagements at Kings Mountain and Cowpens chipped away at Cornwallis's army. By early 1781, after his costly and ultimately inconclusive victory at Guilford Courthouse, a battle so expensive that one member of Parliament reportedly said another such victory would ruin the British Army, Cornwallis made a decision that would define the rest of the war. Rather than return to South Carolina to consolidate what remained of the Southern strategy, he marched his exhausted army north into Virginia. It was, depending on which historian you ask, either bold initiative or a serious overreach. Virginia had no organized British base of operations, no friendly territory waiting to receive him. What it had was the Marquis de Lafayette, the young French aristocrat serving in the Continental Army, commanding a much smaller American force that began shadowing Cornwallis's movements across the state, harassing his supply lines without risking a full engagement he could not win. And hovering over all of this, unresolved and increasingly toxic, was the relationship between Cornwallis and his commanding officer in New York, General Henry Clinton. The breakdown between Cornwallis and Clinton is one of the more remarkable command failures in the history of the British Army, and it sits at the absolute center of why Yorktown happened the way it did. Clinton, based in New York, was deeply anxious throughout the summer of 1781 about a possible Franco-American assault on his own position. He had reason to be anxious. Washington genuinely wanted to attack New York and had been pushing for exactly that operation in his discussions with his French counterpart, the Comte de Rochambeau. Clinton's correspondence with Cornwallis throughout this period reads like a man changing his mind multiple times within the same week. First requesting Cornwallis send troops north to reinforce New York, then countermanding that order and instructing him instead to fortify a defensible deepwater port somewhere on the Virginia coast where the Royal Navy could resupply and reinforce him. Cornwallis disagreed with the deepwater port strategy from the outset. He pointed out, correctly as it turned out, that the geography of the Chesapeake Bay made any such position permanently vulnerable to a determined naval power. If the Royal Navy ever lost control of the surrounding waters, even temporarily, a fortified post on the Chesapeake became a trap rather than a sanctuary. He raised these objections. Clinton, his superior officer, overruled him. Cornwallis complied, though he did so under formal written protest. He inspected several potential sites along the Virginia coast and settled on Yorktown, a town on a high bluff above the York River, protected on its landward approaches by ravines and swampy creeks, with a sister fortification across the river at Gloucester Point controlling river traffic. On August 2, 1781, Cornwallis began fortifying the position. It was, in isolation, a defensible choice. Yorktown's strength depended entirely on one assumption holding true, that the Royal Navy would maintain control of the waters around the Chesapeake. If that assumption ever failed, every advantage the position offered turned instantly into a liability. A peninsula becomes a cul-de-sac the moment the water itself belongs to the enemy. That assumption was about to fail in spectacular fashion. While Cornwallis was digging in at Yorktown, George Washington was looking at the map of the war and seeing an opportunity that almost nobody else recognized in time. Washington's preferred strategy throughout much of 1781 was an attack on Clinton's main force in New York City, the symbolic and strategic heart of the British war effort in America. Rochambeau, the experienced French commander whose army had joined Washington's near New York, had nearly 40 years of military experience to Washington's relatively limited record of major field victories. But Rochambeau, in one of the more quietly remarkable acts of deference in the entire war, had been instructed by his own government to defer to Washington's strategic judgment rather than impose his own. He told Washington directly that he had come to serve, not to command. Even with that deference, Rochambeau gently but persistently argued for a different target. He believed an attack on heavily fortified New York was too costly and too uncertain. He argued, based on intelligence about French naval movements in the Caribbean, that the French fleet under Admiral François-Joseph Paul, Comte de Grasse, was likely to sail for the American coast that summer, and that wherever de Grasse chose to bring his fleet would determine where a decisive combined operation could actually succeed. In mid-August 1781, the answer arrived. De Grasse intended to sail not to New York, but to the Chesapeake Bay, bringing with him 28 ships of the line and thousands of additional French troops. Washington made his decision almost immediately. He would abandon, at least for now, the dream of retaking New York. Instead, he and Rochambeau would march their combined armies, roughly 2,000 Continentals and 4,500 French troops, some 400 miles south to Virginia, to combine with Lafayette's smaller force and with de Grasse's fleet, and trap Cornwallis exactly where he had dug himself in. The deception that accompanied this march was as important as the march itself. Washington left a portion of his force behind near New York under General William Heath, ordered the construction of visible bake ovens and other supply infrastructure, suggesting a permanent siege encampment was being prepared, and otherwise did everything possible to convince Clinton that the real American objective remained New York City. It worked for nearly 2 weeks. By the time Clinton realized in late August that Washington's army was, in fact, marching for Virginia and not preparing a siege at his own doorstep, the combined Franco-American force already had an insurmountable head start. Clinton sent an urgent warning south to Cornwallis. The Americans were on the move, and he should expect reinforcement by sea. That promise of reinforcement would prove to be the single most consequential broken assurance of the entire war. On September 5, 1781, while Washington's army was still marching south, the war's true turning point happened at sea, off the entrance to the Chesapeake Bay, in a battle that Cornwallis himself never saw and could do nothing about. Admiral Thomas Grave, commanding a British fleet of 19 ships of the line, arrived at the mouth of the Chesapeake, expecting to find the bay open and undefended, or at most lightly contested. What greeted him instead was, in the words of one British officer present, a forest of masts. The Comte de Grasse's fleet of 24 to 28 ships of the line, anchored just inside Cape Henry, having arrived ahead of him via a route through the Caribbean specifically chosen to avoid detection. What followed, known to history as the Battle of the Virginia Capes, was tactically inconclusive, a few hours of long-range gunnery exchange that produced relatively modest casualties on both sides and ended without either fleet achieving a decisive blow. But its strategic consequences were enormous. De Grasse, despite the indecisive fighting, succeeded in keeping his fleet positioned between Grave and the entrance to the bay. After several days of cautious maneuvering and a standoff that gave neither admiral confidence in pressing the engagement further, Grave made the decision that effectively ended British hopes at Yorktown. He withdrew his battered fleet back to New York for repairs. This was not a battle that anyone watching it in real time recognized as one of the most consequential naval engagements in American history. It produced no dramatic single moment, no decisive destruction of an enemy fleet, nothing that would make for an obviously cinematic centerpiece. And yet the British naval historian Sir William James would later call it, quite simply, the decisive battle of the war. With Grave gone, de Grasse's fleet had unchallenged control of the Chesapeake. The French could now safely ferry French troops, heavy siege artillery, and supplies down the bay to join Washington's and Rochambeau's marching armies. More importantly, with the Royal Navy no longer able to contest the waters around Yorktown, Cornwallis's only viable route of escape or resupply by sea had been quietly, almost bloodlessly, closed. Cornwallis did not yet know how completely his situation had changed. He was still operating under Clinton's assurance that relief was coming. What was actually coming, by land and by water, was a combined Franco-American force that would soon outnumber his garrison roughly 2 to 1. By the end of September 1781, the trap around Yorktown was essentially complete. Washington and Rochambeau's combined army, ferried down the Chesapeake under the protection of de Grasse's fleet, landed at Williamsburg and linked up with Lafayette's force, which had spent the summer shadowing Cornwallis across Virginia. The combined Franco-American army that converged on Yorktown by late September numbered close to 17,000 men, against Cornwallis's garrison of roughly 8,000 to 9,000 British and Hessian troops. The French took up positions on the left of the Allied line, the Americans on the right. The siege itself began on September 28, 1781, and unfolded with the methodical, almost mathematical inevitability of 18th-century siege warfare, a discipline of war that Rochambeau and his French officers, trained in the rigorous European tradition of engineers like Vauban, understood with professional precision. Trenches called parallels were dug progressively closer to the British defenses, each one bringing allied artillery within more effective range, while the British, hopelessly outgunned, attempted to hold their outer redoubts and wear down the besiegers through sallies and bombardment of their own. Cornwallis, in an attempt to shorten his defensive perimeter and concentrate his shrinking garrison, abandoned several of his outer fortifications relatively early in the siege, a decision that almost certainly accelerated his eventual collapse, since it allowed the Allied forces to advance their second parallel trench far more quickly than a fully contested defense would have permitted. On October 14th, in one of the siege's sharpest engagements, French and American assault columns stormed and captured two key British strongpoints, redoubts 9 and 10, in coordinated night attacks. The fall of these two positions allowed Allied artillery to be brought to bear on Yorktown itself from three directions simultaneously, and the bombardment that followed was, by every account from soldiers and civilians caught inside the town, almost unbearable. British soldiers, along with officers' wives and the wounded, were reduced to sheltering in caves dug directly into the riverbank to escape the constant shelling. Cornwallis attempted one final, desperate gambit on the night of October 16th, an effort to evacuate his army across the York River to Gloucester Point, escape the closing trap, and break out toward New York overland. The boats had begun ferrying troops across when a sudden violent squall scattered the small craft and made further crossings impossible. The attempt was abandoned, and the boats that had already crossed had to make their way back under cover of darkness. By the morning of October 17th, with his ammunition running low, his defenses crumbling, his men exhausted, and no sign whatsoever of Clinton's promised relief fleet, Cornwallis made the only decision left available to him. Before we get to that surrender, real quick, if this kind of granular, accurate breakdown of how a war actually gets decided is the kind of content you want more of, subscribe and drop a comment telling me what other battle or campaign you'd want covered next. It genuinely shapes what gets researched. The negotiations took 2 days, not because there was any real military question left to resolve, but because Cornwallis, even in defeat, was attempting to extract whatever favorable terms he could, and some historians believe, quietly hopping to buy enough time for Clinton's relief fleet to finally appear on the horizon. Washington, who understood exactly what Cornwallis was doing, was in no hurry to make it easy for him. On October 19, 1781, the formal surrender ceremony took place in a field outside Yorktown. British and Hessian troops marched out between two lines of victorious soldiers, French forces arrayed on one side in their crisp white uniforms, American Continentals on the other in whatever uniforms and equipment 8 years of grinding war had left them with. The British colours were cased and furled, carried rather than displayed, a traditional mark of surrender. Witnesses on both sides described the British soldiers as marching with a kind of sullen, deliberate refusal to look at their American counterparts, eyes fixed instead on the French, perhaps unable, even in total defeat, to fully accept that it was American colonials and not a fellow European power who had brought them to this field. Cornwallis himself did not appear at the ceremony. He sent word that he was too ill to attend, a claim that has been debated by historians ever since, with many concluding that whatever physical illness he may have had was compounded by something closer to simple humiliation. In his place, he delegated the actual surrender to his subordinate, Brigadier General Charles O'Hara, who rode forward to formally hand over Cornwallis's sword. What happened next has become one of the most retold moments of the entire war, and like many such moments, the precise details are debated. O'Hara reportedly attempted to deliver the sword to the senior officer present, Comte de Rochambeau, an apparent attempt, intentional or not, to surrender symbolically to France rather than to the colonial army that had spent 6 years fighting for its own legitimacy. Rochambeau, by most accounts, gestured O'Hara toward Washington instead. Washington, in turn, declined to personally accept the sword from a subordinate officer when the actual commanding general was simply choosing not to appear, and directed O'Hara to his own second-in-command, General Benjamin Lincoln, who, fittingly, had himself surrendered an American army to the British at Charleston the previous year, and was now on the receiving end of an almost mirror-image moment of vindication. The numbers handed over that day were staggering by the standards of the entire war. Approximately 7,000 to 8,000 British and Hessian soldiers, nearly 900 sailors, 144 cannons, dozens of ships, and vast quantities of military stores. According to a story that has become deeply embedded in American memory, though its precise documentation is less certain than the legend suggests, the British military band played a tune called "The World Turned Upside Down" as the defeated army marched into captivity. Whether or not that specific song was actually played, the title could not have been more fitting. Yorktown did not, technically, end the American Revolutionary War. Skirmishes continued in isolated pockets for nearly 2 more years. The formal Treaty of Paris, which finally recognized American independence, would not be signed until September 1783. British forces remained garrisoned in New York City for 2 more years after Cornwallis's surrender. But everyone who mattered understood, almost immediately, that the war was effectively over the moment news of Yorktown reached London. When the report arrived in Britain in late November 1781, Prime Minister Lord North reportedly responded with the words, "Oh God, it is all over," repeating the phrase several times, according to those present, in a state described as something close to physical shock. North's government, which had presided over the entire war and had repeatedly insisted, through 6 years of escalating cost and casualties, that one more campaign would finally crush the rebellion, collapsed in March 1782. The incoming Rockingham ministry immediately opened serious peace negotiations with the Americans, negotiations that had been politically impossible just months earlier. The reasons Yorktown landed with such finality go beyond the simple loss of one army, however large. Britain had now lost 2 entire field armies in North America within a span of 4 years. Burgoyne's force at Saratoga in 1777, and now Cornwallis's at Yorktown in 1781. The financial cost of the war, already staggering, had grown completely unsustainable, compounded by the fact that Britain was now fighting not just the American rebellion, but a wider global war against France, Spain, and the Dutch Republic, all of whom had been drawn in by the same diplomatic momentum that Saratoga had originally created. There simply was no political appetite left in Parliament, and increasingly no available manpower or money to raise yet another army and ship it across the Atlantic for a 3rd attempt. Cornwallis, remarkably, did not see his career destroyed by Yorktown the way Burgoyne's had been destroyed by Saratoga, or the way Gage's had collapsed after Bunker Hill. He returned to Britain, weathered a bitter public dispute with Clinton in which both men published competing accounts, attempting to shift blame for the disaster onto the other, and went on to a long and largely successful subsequent career, eventually serving as Governor-General of India. History, in this particular case, proved considerably kinder to the losing general than it did to his commanding officer back in New York, whose contradictory orders and failure to deliver promised relief became the central villain of the entire post-war recriminations. What actually decided Yorktown, when you strip away the dramatic surrender ceremony and the famous painting that now hangs in the Capitol Rotunda, was a sequence of decisions made almost entirely outside the control of the man who ultimately bore the humiliation: Clinton's contradictory orders. The geographic vulnerability of a deepwater port Cornwallis himself had warned against. A naval battle off the Virginia Capes that Cornwallis never witnessed, fought between 2 fleets over a stretch of open water that nonetheless sealed his fate as completely as any infantry assault could have. A 400-mile march, disguised behind bake ovens and false camps, that fooled Clinton just long enough to matter. Cornwallis was, by any honest measure, one of the most capable generals Britain sent to fight in America. He had outmaneuvered Washington directly in 1776. He had crushed an entire American army at Camden. And none of that mattered once he found himself on a peninsula with his back to a river that the Royal Navy could no longer guarantee, waiting for a relief fleet that arrived 5 days too late to matter. If this is the kind of history you want more of, the decisions behind the decisions, the moments that actually tip a war rather than just the famous headlines, subscribe and tell me in the comments which single decision you think mattered most. Clinton ordering the Deepwater port, Rochambeau steering Washington toward Virginia instead of New York, or Admiral Grave choosing to withdraw after the Battle of the Capes. History turned on all three. I'd genuinely like to know which one you'd undo first.